Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all back to Trinity Global Humanities Lecture Series and to introduce the second lecture in this year's program, delivered once again by Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta. This year's series, titled Our Unborn World, takes its name from a powerful phrase in Radhakrishnan's 1936 inaugural lecture at Oxford, "The world's unborn soul," a phrase that Professor Mehta recovered and reanimated in his inaugural lecture 1 week ago. In returning us to that seminal moment, he invited us to consider how, long before our current discourses on globalization or identity politics, thinkers like Radhakrishnan were already grappling with the deep fault lines within modernity. Between the universal promise of reason on the one hand and the particular demands of culture on the other, between expansive cosmopolitan visions and the pool of rooted belonging between agency and structure. This tension, which is never resolved, offers, at least I think so, a powerful framework for thinking about what a global humanities might mean today. And this was something that I'm very grateful for us to begin considering and discussing. Namely, not the flattening of difference into abstract universals, nor the celebration of diversity for its own sake, but rather the possibility of a shared intellectual space that is capacious enough to hold contradiction, historical injustice, and epistemic plurality. It invites us to imagine the humanities not only as a repository of cultural forms, but rather as a world-making tool. I was particularly struck by Professor Mehta's emphasis on Radhakrishnan's vision of, and I quote him, "the whole world as a cultural base." A quietly radical formulation that invites us to think beyond inherited boundaries and to recover the ethical and imaginative stakes of a global humanistic inquiry. Today, as you can see here, Professor Mehta continues this arc with a lecture entitled Alternative Modernities, India and Political Thought in a Global Frame. It promises to extend and deepen the questions posed in his first talk by exploring how traditions of Indian political thought have offered not merely responses to modernity, but alternative articulations of it. Professor Mehta, as we said, is currently a Laurence S. Rockefeller Visiting Professor at Princeton University. He has taught in so many places. A leading political theorist and intellectual historian, his work spans questions of liberalism, constitutionalism, secularism, the university, and the possibilities of democratic renewal. He's also one of the most eloquent public intellectuals writing today, consistently bringing philosophical depth to urgent political questions and political urgency to philosophical debate. So please join me in warmly welcoming to Cambridge and to Trinity back Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta.
Thank you, Carlos, for not only that over-generous introduction, but a better summary of the first lecture than the lecture was. And thank you all for coming. I know I had lots of competition in the university today, so it's heroic of you to be here. So what I'm going to do today is sort of talk about Indian political thought. And it's, of course, a reckless enterprise to talk about Indian political thought in about 55 to 60 minutes. What I want to do is sort of build on the argument that I laid down in the first lecture, which was that there are these different traditions that have this sort of meta-narrative, and that each of these meta-narratives is showing, let's put it this way, signs of internal morbidity. And what I'll try and explain is how has Indian political thought come to that position. And part of course, that diagnosis is not just that political thought is showing morbidity, but that it is a form of morbidity that gets reflected in politics and kind of speaks to a kind of legitimation crisis of this moment. So my route into making this argument will be slightly circuitous, and it in a sense begins with a joke. Like all jokes have kind of more insight in them than most political theory does. So this is a joke amongst Indian jurists. And the joke goes like this, which is, who invented the idea of the end of history? Or the concept, right? Now, most of us would say Francis Fukuyama, right? At least he made it famous and made it a operative concept in terms of how we describe the state of the world. And the Indian jurist's retort to that is, no, it's not Francis Fukuyama. It's actually the Indian Supreme Court. What do we mean by that? Well, in 1973, the Indian Supreme Court famously enunciated the basic structure doctrine of the Indian Constitution, which basically said that the Constitution could not be amended even if the amendment was carried out by a duly legal amending process, right? And of course, the context of the way in which the basic structure doctrine has been, in a sense, deployed it's vague, it's been inconsistently applied, but for lawyers and constitutional specialists, this was this massive innovation, right? A kind of cultivation of a legal tool by which the judiciary could, in a sense, check the encroachment of executive power, right? Not just check the encroachment of executive power, actually check the encroachment of popular sovereignty on constitutionalism. Right? Now, at one level, this kind of idea is very familiar in constitutional discourse. And I want to kind of move from constitution into political theory. But if you think about it, it's a very, very peculiar idea. I mean, it's a peculiar idea in the sense it says, here is a basic normative structure that now exists out of time, which no one shall amend, no one will have the authority to amend, right? Not even the sovereign people will have the authority to amend. It's a kind of normative framework within whose horizons all political activity and theorizing has to, in a sense, take place, right? I mean, you might say in some senses, the basic structure is the end of history. It is kind of the summum bonum, the telos of, in a sense, Indian modernity, right? Now, as I said, I think the jurisprudential arguments, the political saliency of that doctrine was understandable. But if you think about it in terms of kind of the metaphysical claim it involves, right? In a sense, the normative horizons of Indian history have ended with the basic structure doctrine, right? Everything else has to now operate within this framework. To use Indian language, the basic structure is now India's Sanatan Dharma. This eternal truths, right, to which every other kind of doctrine will have to, in some senses, measure up. Now, of course, I said at one level, the centrality of the Constitution is understandable. It is a form in which modern social contracts are sometimes codified. The Indian Constitution was a practical settlement born in the shadow of partition, with its peculiar combination of principle and compromise. And it was a form in which the framers of Indian Constitution thought India's future could be imagined. Its great hope was reflected in the fact that it proclaims liberty, equality, and fraternity as its lodestars, not faith, history, and identity. And since we are Cambridge, it's worth remembering that the first Cambridge chair of political science, Ernest Barker, actually thought of the distinctiveness of the Indian preamble precisely in these terms, that it's a constitution that does not refer to the historical identity of India. It's just simple liberty, equality, fraternity, not faith, history, and identity. And it referred to, and this was a conscious move, not because Indian politicians or framers thought faith, identity, and history were not important. God knows they thought it was important and were burdened by it, right? But you might say it was almost because they thought it was too important to be left to constitutionalism or to be argued out in the domain of constitutional law. This was something that citizens should, as private citizens, debate endlessly. You know, the Constitution doesn't have to take a view on how do we benchmark India's identity, right? It just provides a basic framework of values within which these debates will be conducted. Now, as we know, of course, with the promulgation of the Indian Constitution, as Ambedkar had pointed out, there was one principal contradiction. Ambedkar famously said, India is now entering a constitutional age of equality, but it is entering it in circumstances, right, where its social structure is rife with inequality, right? How does one reconcile a seemingly egalitarian constitution with one of the most horrendously inegalitarian social structures any human society had seen? But of course, this problem, this contradiction, was not peculiar to India. And I think this is a problem, in a sense, modern constitutionalism wrestles with. It has to do with the theoretical structure of modern constitutionalism. As thinkers from Marx, and I think every Indian thinker on the Constitution was aware of something like this idea, as thinkers onwards from Marx onward have pointed out, modern constitutions claim not to represent any form of social power, right? They're formal constitutions. I mean, that's Marx's critique of modern constitutionalism in some senses. And it's also, in a sense, one explanation for the staying power of modern constitutionalism, which is that precisely its formality allows it to present itself as this kind of teleological end of history moment. This understanding of constitutionalism is, of course, very different from traditional understandings of constitutionalism, including in India. In traditional understandings of constitutionalism, actually the function of a constitution just is to represent different forms of social power, right? If you think of checks and balances in traditional forms of constitutionalism, those checks and balances do not come primarily from formal institutional designs, separation of executive, judiciary, legislature, right? Historically, they primarily came from the way in which the Constitution represented the balance between different classes or different social forces in society, right? And in this sense, as Marx pointed out, modern Constitution was very much a kind of 19th century innovation. Now, and Ambedkar is, in a sense, deeply, in a sense, aware of this fact. So, in pre-19th century constitutions, if you ask the question, what does it mean to change a constitution? The simple answer is, a reductionist but simple answer is, a change in constitution just is a change in the balance of social forces that get formally represented in the constitution, right? Those forces could be different. There could be bourgeoisie, capitalism, there could be labor. And as many of you knew, till probably the late 19th century, as my friend Greg Conti has argued in a very significant book on British parliamentary representation, much of the debate was really about, right, how, in a sense, the formal institutions actually represent social power. Do they represent a mixture of social classes? What are those social constituents that a constitution should represent, right? Now, Ambedkar's dilemma, as we know, was the constitution formally does not represent any social power, and yet society is structured by a form of social power. In Ambedkar's case, of course, the primary preoccupation was with caste, but not just with caste, particularly with the condition of Dalits and former untouchables, groups that had been the object of horrendous discrimination and exclusion, required some formal acknowledgement in this constitutional scheme. The constitutional scheme, even while, in a sense, presenting itself as above social power, had to provide the instruments, in some senses, to redress the balance of that social power. Right? And in independent India, subsequently, in the debates that have followed, essentially there have been kind of two views on how this constitution does it. And trust me, I'm coming to political theory in a second. Hopefully you'll see the relevance of this. One view has been, which I think was Ambedkar's view, right, that the representation of social power in formal structures of government through constitutional means, let's say through quotas, through affirmative action, through reservation, was an exceptional measure. Exceptional measure meaning that the group to which it should be applied, right, particularly the Dalits, the threshold of justification to be included in that scheme was extraordinarily high, right? And two, it was an exceptional measure in the sense that the purpose of it was in some senses to counter discrimination and exclusion. It was a kind of form of inclusion, right? That's kind of one version of that, how that constitution relates to the social power of caste. A different version of that, which is increasingly gaining ground in India, right, which has now arguably got more political traction in India, actually says no. The Indian constitution is actually a social contract for the distribution of power between differently constituted castes that are pre-constituted outside of politics. So it means, for example, that reservations, affirmative action, inclusion is not an exception, both numerically confined to 20%, 50 or 49%. Now there is actually literally a proposal, right, and which is gaining political traction, that the legitimacy of this constitutional scheme depends on the formal structures of representation pretty much exactly mirroring the caste composition of Indian society. As you know, India has just announced that it's going to conduct a caste census again after 100 years, right? So this is literally, I mean, there's a kind of odd temporality about this. As Greg Conti had powerfully argued, in 19th century constitutionalism and debates about representative government, this idea that the constitution should, in some senses, mirror the social composition of society, right? Formally represent different forms of social power. That doctrine, in a sense, came to an end in part because, right, it was not obvious by the late 19th century what the constituent units of social power are that, in a sense, should be represented, right? It is class. If it's class, what kinds of classes? Why not intellectuals? Why not gender? I mean, you can run the story different kinds of ways, right? And that one of the promises of modernity precisely is that actually not only does it, in some senses, institutionalize representative government, it actually promises to dissolve the salience of these pre-constituted forms of social power. These will become more fluid, more mobile, such that, in a sense, it's hard to characterize them as units that you could, in some ways, represent, right? And as you know, this dilemma has been a kind of history of constitutionalism pretty much, pretty much everywhere. But the reason I'm beginning with this, and then I'll kind of segue back to the 19th century and alternative modernities Indian political thought, is if somebody were to ask the question, what is Indian political theory right now, right? Essentially, you will come up with something like the following answer, which is it's either a defensive clutching on to the basic structure doctrine, right? In the face of, you might say, depending on your point of view, the popular assault of Hindu nationalism, right? In a sense, that's the horizon beyond which we do not want to move, right? A defensive liberal constitutionalism whose social roots are becoming increasingly tenuous. Or it is, in a sense, the second narrative, that even though normatively history ended with the promulgation of the basic structure doctrine, we actually need to get social forms, in some sense, to catch up with the normative promise of that constitution in terms of the distribution of power. Okay? And you might say, if you think of how contemporary Indian democracy is being imagined, right, it is largely being imagined in these two frames and these two conjunctions. Okay? And what I want to begin by, in a sense, saying, I mean, why I've in a sense ended with this, is that if you look at the sweep of 19th and 20th century Indian political thought, this seems an extraordinary diminution of the horizons of that political thinking. Now, I don't want to underestimate the political importance of holding on to a certain kind of constitutionalism. God knows we need it even more now in terms of, protection of basic civil liberties and so forth, right? But I think it does speak to, in a sense, this moment where all we have left, in some ways, by way of the assertion of political agency, is this kind of fixed normative horizon which we are clutching on to desperately. Now, there are many histories of Indian political thought, and there are very many different ways of carving out the field of Indian political theory. What I want to do in the next sort of 25, 30 minutes is to gesture at three different ways in which the question of the modernity of Indian political thought was debated. Often, when this question is discussed in histories of Indian political thought, this question is often discussed in terms of, is there a distinction between westernization and modernization? It's often discussed in terms of the anxieties of influence, right? In some senses, does the embracing of modernity foreclose the possibility of an authentic Indian identity? These are very familiar debates in some senses in post-colonial discourse. What I want to talk about, as I said, is three different registers in which the question of modern comes up. The first register is the question of representation. The second is the register of community. And the third is the register of ethical life. And I'll try and show that there's a kind of intimate connection between these, in a sense, three registers. But I first want to tell the story about each one of them individually, very briefly, and then hopefully draw the kind of connections between them. So, the modern and Indian political thought, of course, comes in very many different forms. In the early 19th century, there's a bewildering variety of arguments in what is now kind of strangely called the Bengal Renaissance, where there's a clear embrace of rationalism, science, equality, even deism, right? All of this is sort of very assiduously embraced in the early years of 19th century Bengal. Figures like Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chand Vidyasagar, even extend these arguments to the embrace of the British enactment of legislative reform of Indian social institutions. And in some ways, you could argue that this was a moment which sort of unproblematically, in some senses, embraced the institutionalization of some forms of English institutions, but embraced them by actually often going beyond them in some ways, demanding more of them than even the English were, right? There is also a parallel reform story that is being told in the princely states of India of reformist monarchies, particularly states like Travancore and Baroda, which, for want of a better word, are trying to, in a sense, put forth a political theory which combines this sort of, a discourse of a kind of modernized reformist kingship with modern administrative law reform, right? So there's a whole bunch of kind of arguments about modernity and state building, right? But most observers would agree that 1857 is a radical rupture in thinking about Indian traditions of political thought, not just because it is the formal end of the Mughal Empire and Mughal sovereignty, but it is astonishing in retrospect that how early, as soon as literally 1857, the question of universal suffrage and what representation might mean in the 19th century is already on the agenda. While the prospect for independence, self-government is still almost a century away, right? The idea that whatever else India's future might be, it will be some form of representative government, right, is already beginning to take hold. There is a lot of political thought in the mid-19th century that is of a kind of diagnostic character, a lot of Muslim political thought, why, Muslims for the first time in India, in the subcontinent, are in this predicament of not having, in some senses, access to a major source of political power. There's a lot of diagnostic about what is it that makes colonial powers so successful, what are the forms of organization, in some senses, that make them such powerful sources of power. But the one question which begins to haunt Indian political thought is, in a sense, the question of, quote unquote, the minority, right? It is in the context of representative government and in the context of possibly universal suffrage that the question of minority and majority acquires a very different and significant political salience. I mean, to put it literally and crudely, in empires, the question of majority and minority has a very different meaning than it does in context of universal suffrage, where literally, in some senses, numbers matter, right? And the structure of a particular dilemma began to take shape in thinking about representative government. The structure of that dilemma went something like this. Again, let's for a moment take Hindus and Muslims as two categories. The history is actually much more complicated, but to see the structure of the political theory dilemma, this is probably sufficient. Think of two communities, Hindus and Muslims. Yes, they are internally differentiated. You can argue, depending on your point of view, they are internally differentiated with different points of view, different interests, in a sense, different contradictions. But in relation to each other, they, in a sense, can be historically demarcated, right? Imagine further that each of these communities has an investment in creating or maintaining some form of collective institutional life, possibly sanctioned by the state or supported by the state, not entirely outside of the state. So it's not just like, a voluntary church or something, right? Some vestments of collective life that actually give expression to those community identities. It could be Sharia law, it could be, bans on cow slaughter, some vestment of that identity that in some senses recognized and enforced by the state, not just, in a sense, left to private agency. The identity of these two communities, or the political demands that they place on the state, are actually reciprocally formed, which is if one community makes demand X, another community will make, in a sense, a corresponding demand, right? So in some senses, if you might say, to use kind of reductionist language, the preference functions of each community are in part shaped by the preferences of, in some senses, another community. Imagine further that all this is happening in the context of a modern state. And the reason that is important is that a modern state cannot simply be a neutral empire between two communities. In part because the modern state itself has an ambitious, in some senses, reformist agenda. It can't, in some senses, adjudicate neutrally between two communities because the state's own agenda might affect these communities asymmetrically, right? Again, in some senses, a very, very familiar problem. And furthermore, add to this, that there is a complex of historical memories between these two communities. That is a complex of coexistence and conflict, but that creates the conditions for the condition that Professor Kapila has very eloquently described as kind of violent fraternity in some ways, or at least that potential is there, right? Now, how do you imagine a form of representation and political structure in such a context, right? What would be a solution, in a sense, to that would enable these two communities to be fully politically represented? One could argue that one way of looking at Indian political history narrowly and Indian political thought is that basically from 1857 to 1947, right, essentially India was searching for an answer to this question. And the challenge rather for representative government is that there's actually no stable solution that actually would in some senses answer this conundrum. Lots of different proposals were tried, right? Power sharing, non-territorial federalism, provincial federalism in some senses with a weak center. I mean, all kinds of proposals, institutional proposals, right, were in some senses put on the table. And none of them in some ways secured the relevant political agreement, right? Now, often when Indian historiography writes about this episode, and it writes about it as a matter of politics, right? If only Jinnah had been more reasonable, if only Congress party had been more reasonable, if only in 1935, after the elections in Uttar Pradesh, Congress had shown more magnanimity to the Muslim League. I mean, it's in a sense that history is almost depicted as a kind of history of some kind of contingently failed political negotiation, right? But suppose we contemplate a slightly more depressing possibility. And the depressing possibility is that there was not going to be a solution to this conundrum because of the way in which the problem was posed in the first place, right? That there was actually a deeper theoretical and conceptual reason why all negotiations over creating a form of representative government that would be acceptable to both Hindus and Muslims actually failed from 1857 to 1947, right? What might that conceptual reason be? And it has then some bearing on how we actually think about the modernity of Indian political thought. So there are, in some senses, three conceptual reasons why, and perhaps with hindsight, this was a process that was designed to fail. The first reason is simply that you cannot bootstrap fair terms of representation through a representative process itself, right? I mean, you see the conceptual bootstrapping problem, right? Which is to say, the object of negotiation is what are going to be fair terms of representation, right? That allow these communities to share power in a stable equilibrium. How do you decide what those fair terms of representation are in the absence of a representative process, right? And you remember, right, the debate over that representative process was different parties claiming to be the fair arbiter of that representative process. Congress saying, no, we can represent everybody, right? Jinnah saying, no, I can represent, right, this community, right? So one of the challenges in thinking about representation was that, in a sense, it was hard to bootstrap terms of fair representation through a process that was itself had any degree of fairness. The second, in a sense, conceptual reason why this was a negotiation, in a sense, that was, you might say, destined to fail in some ways, is that the demands that were being placed on the representative process were inherently onerous and incompatible. Even though all sides in this negotiation were speaking the language of modern representative government, right? They were bringing to the table incompatible ideas of the relationship between individual freedom and community, incompatible understandings of the project of the modern state, right? And in some cases, the benchmarking of identities that was incompatible with the fluidity and openness of modern democratic systems, right? If one were to put it dramatically, if you put up all the proposals that were put on the table between, let's say, 1905 and 1947, right? Weak center with territorial federalism, non-territorial federalism, right? Where different communities in some senses get jurisdiction, in some senses, over their own religious laws, personal laws, right? All those dilemmas, all those proposals. One of the striking things is that in each one of those proposals, there is a major, in some senses, normative aspiration that proposal fails to satisfy, right? So, for example, if you went down the route of non-territorial federalism, giving communities greater power against the state to manage their own affairs in, let's say, property, law, inheritance, so on and so forth, what we now call personal law, right? In some senses, it's clear, right? The casualty of that was going to be to limit the state's capacity for modernization. A potential casualty of that was, in a sense, going to be to limit the state's capacity to disembed the individuals from, in a sense, these substantial community identities, which is also part of the project of the modern state, right? One thing's got to give in, something's got to give in some ways, right? And one of the things I think we realized, in a sense, by 1947, this old kind of line that India could neither be united nor divided, right? Or as I think Alfred Coburn, it's a phrase attributed to him, partition was a non-solution to an insoluble problem, right? Right? Was precisely that the terms in which the problem had been posed, right? There was just no equilibrium solution, right? Either too many incompatible values were being put in some senses. The representative process was being burdened by too many incompatible values, right? Or, as I said, we could not politically convince ourselves that this debate over representation was actually indeed a debate over, was resulting in outcomes that were indeed, in some senses, fair and stable, right? And so what India discovered, Indian political thought or Indian thinking about democracy discovered, right, was, you might say, this kind of insoluble trilemma that it was hard to reconcile democracy, representation, and identity politics. One of these three poles, in some senses, had to give. Although what is astonishing in retrospect is how very few people in 1947 actually thought that. I mean, I think there's still this kind of faith that somehow there'll be a political process that could, in some senses, resolve these issues. And so one of the kind of tragedies, in some senses, of the birth of the subcontinent was that the structures of representative government, modern representative democracy, were meant to, in a sense, solve these identity conundrums. And yet it turned out, right, that these structures of representation could be trusted the least when they were actually tested by the burdens of those identity. And in some senses, this is a political problem that, in some senses, still shadows modern India, right? This distinctive form in which we thought we would solve the conundrum of representation, right, ended up in something like a modus vivendi whose first principles are still not actually clear. Right? Now, you might say, okay, what has this got to do with, in a sense, alternative modernities? Very briefly, and in much more briefly, there were two other registers in which the modernity of Indian political thought was debated. So one, as I said, is on this terrain of representation, which ends in this, you might say, tragic end in some ways, right? The second register was what you might call a kind of register of community, right? Now, this register of community, in part, took its cue from the fact that so much of modern Indian political thought, most notably Gandhi, but not just Gandhi, I mean, practically large number of thinkers writing in the early 20th century, directed their critique to the modern state. right? The modern state was this mechanical organization, externally imposed on the organic life of communities and individuals, right? And maintained largely by force and coercion, right? I mean, as you know, this is a kind of familiar fact. Critique of the modern state was taken almost as a sort of article of faith in large chunks of, in a sense, Indian political theory. On this view, the problem with the modern state and colonialism, right, was not just that it subjugated a people and prevented their self-determination, right? The problem was that in some senses it ruptured and severed organic forms of social relationships that in some senses already existed in many of those societies, right? And here, if you think of self-determination, you can think of two meanings. One conventional meaning, which a lot has been written about Nazmul Sultan's recent book in some senses, where self-determination is tied to the idea of popular sovereignty, right? That part of the project of anti-colonial thought is to, in some senses, create a people that is, in some senses, self-determined. But if you examine, right, this kind of community-based notion of self-determination, the problem with colonialism, right, was that it actually ruptured a determinate set of social relations. Right? You see the kind of subtle difference? One conception of self-determination is a purely political one, allied to modern doctrines of popular sovereignty. Right? We as a people come together as free and equal people, unite as a people. Right? The other conception of self-determination was that there is a determinate set of social relationships that pre-exist in society, kinship, village republics, sometimes even caste, right? And part of what the modern state does, it in some senses ruptures those relationships. And so this community-based critique in some senses of the modern state was simultaneously a critique of the state, but it was also simultaneously a critique of popular sovereignty, right? In part because, right, popular sovereignty, like the state, in some senses ruptures this variety of determinate social relationships that actually constitute the organic life of the people, right? Now, there were incredibly powerful theoretical attempts, sometimes drawing from English pluralists, to say that if you want to carve out a distinctive domain of the political, the site of that cannot be the state, because the state is the ultimate anti-political institution. Why? Because it ultimately relies on force, right? The site of that cannot be popular sovereignty, right? Because one, popular sovereignty is more likely to align with the state, but popular sovereignty also in some senses ruptures that organic flow of life and all these intermediate social identities, right? And again, so much of Indian political thought, the quest for an alternative Indian modernity, was basically premised on an idea, are there forms of organic relationships that exist outside of the state, right? That one could characterize as, in some senses, constituting the Sittlichkeit, the substantive modern life of communities. And politics is to be located in the negotiation of these substantive forms of life, not in the state and not in popular sovereignty. So one prominent example of this line of thinking theoretical is, of course, Radhakamal Mukherjee, Democracies of the East. This extraordinary book he writes in the early 1920s, a 500-page book on democracy in India and China, right? And that's, in a sense, the central claim of that book. But you can see a kind of Gandhian version of this as well. Now, this line of political inquiry, that what would be distinctive about Indian political thought was it would refuse both the state and popular sovereignty, right? Pretty much kind of collapsed on the weight of its own political weakness. In part of course, because the modernizing impulses of the colonial state and modernity proved, in some senses, too overwhelming, but in part because there was a kind of internal incoherence in that idea. And the internal incoherence stemmed from, right, holding on to this idea that somehow these organic relationships that marked all these social formations like caste and so forth could be in some senses made entirely voluntary, that they could be presented as if they were actually natural emanations of people's freely chosen identities, which are invested in kinship, caste, and so forth, rather than what they actually were, which were compulsory forms of social power, right? So that project, and in some senses, Ambedkar and Nehru's rejection of Gandhiism on that kind of throws that out, right? In a sense, that project failed to underestimate the way in which the social was already dissolving before its very eyes. The third register in which a kind of alternative Indian modernity was imagined is what you might say is an ethical space. The writer Raja Rao was once asked, "What is India?" right? And he replied, "India is a darshan, it's a philosophy." Now, of course, when you say something like this idea elicits a big yawn. You might think of sort of Hegelian worries about India dreaming away itself in the realm of imagination. What do you mean it's a philosophy? But it also generates anxiety for another reason, which is it might conjure up pictures of what Peter Sloterdijk once called India the planetary granary of spiritual narcissism, right? Which is to say, a yearning for forms of spiritual experience that preserve the soul at the expense of devaluing the world. In Platonic terms, on this ethical imagining, India had a lot to offer in terms of illumination of the soul, but it was a form of illumination that left the cave as dark as anybody had found it, right? And so the argument went that this is in part what explained, if you look at the longue durée of Indian intellectual history, incredible metaphysical radicalism of all kinds that easily sat or reconciled with a kind of deep social conservatism, right? Which is in some senses, all metaphysical radicalism ended up in a form of escape. Now, in case you think, well, this must be the Orientalist construction of India, right? India is this land of spiritual narcissists, dreamy seekers, renunciates, seeking illumination of their own soul. You would actually be mistaken. One of the most astonishing things about Indian output in 20th century political thought, and I've been doing actually quantitative stuff on this based on Rahul Sagar's Ideas of India database, is how much of India's best talent in political theory and moral thought was actually obsessed with refuting this charge. The astonishing deployment of philosophical talent, right, from Aurobindo to Surendranath Dasgupta to A.C. Banerjee, is absolutely haunted by this charge. And it produces an extraordinary burst of philosophizing. If you're interested in metaphysics, I think that 20, 30-year period from 1910 to 1940 is truly, absolutely fabulous. But the burden of that project, if you wanted to kind of rescue India as this ethical space, was that it had to revolt against its own tradition, or at least one particular interpretation of its own tradition. And in summary form, I often like to say that almost all modern Hinduism is a revolt against Shankar. Shankar's interpretation of Hinduism, kind of consolidated in the 8th century. It's a revolt against Shankar because it had to refute 3 of Shankar's central metaphysical premises. The first was the significance of the phenomenal world. So this is not all Maya. The phenomenal world itself is, in some senses, an emanation of the divine. Second, a refutation of Shankar's claim that if you actually wanted soteriological emancipation, right? The only pathway to it was a form of extinguishing the self and renunciation. Shivaji Bandyopadhyay has this astonishing book on the Mahabharata, where he actually shows every single Indian political leader, every single without fail, and every single philosopher actually writes a commentary on Bhagavad Gita 247. Right? The shlok about sort of what desireless action might mean. And this desire to refute the idea that the only cogent interpretation of that has to be in some senses renounced. It's absolutely astonishing, right? I mean, you couldn't do serious thinking if you hadn't come to terms with that proposition. And the third and perhaps most difficult one was, could there be possibly a transformation and democratization of the spiritual perfectionism of the Indian tradition, right? Different versions, democratization of Vedanta or whatever, right? Which is there a form of being in existence that in the Indian tradition is available only to a few, to the adept, right? In a sense, those who stand outside of the necessities of society. Could you actually democratize it as a potential future for all of humanity? That is, in a sense, Radhakrishnan's conceit, right? Our unborn soul. That's what, in a sense, India might have to offer. And the argument was very elaborately laid out, is that it is precisely that form of life that would allow overcoming of almost all the ills of modernity, the fragmentation of value, estrangement in some senses from communal life. But the basis of it had to be, in a sense, this kind of ethical rediscovery of the soul. There are different versions of it. You can actually argue that even Gandhi's version, in some ways, of placing non-violence in some senses, right, as itself in an unqualified way at the center of ethics, was also a version of this. I don't have time to go through this, but I have a paper in which I argue actually even Ambedkar, when he in the end discovers Buddha and his Dhamma, right? The claim is in some senses that what he can get out of Buddha, right, is an autonomous moral domain, right? That in some senses has an identity and sanctity of its own. I don't have time to go into it, but what I want to emphasize here, and I kind of close with the representation, is what is common to this project, this invocation of the ethical, is this claim that there is a ethical standpoint that is self-grounded, right? It insists on the autonomy of the ethical in thinking about politics, right? Second, it thinks of the autonomy of the ethical as a prior explanatory principle. So one of the remarkable things, whether it's Ambedkar, whether it's Gandhi, whether it's in some senses Aurobindo, is that the route to political change is through the transformation of ethical life itself. In some senses, institutions are downstream from that ethical transformation, right? The third claim, in some senses, was that if you were to imagine India or the idea of India, it would have to be imagined as an exemplar of this ethical space that acknowledged not just the philosophical autonomy of the ethical, right? But in a sense, the explanatory priority of the ethical, right? So, the rest is all kind of materialistic, power politics, all of that, in some ways. And this would be the standpoint from which Indian tradition would be rewritten. Now, you could argue in some senses, for obvious reasons, that each of the protagonists of this project, imagining India as a kind of alternative ethical space, thought their own projects were colossal failures. In part, they were colossal failures because that act of translating that moral perfectionism into a collective democratic project again, simply proved pretty incoherent in some senses in own terms. But I would also submit in some ways, and I'll talk about this a little more next week, is that it also had something to do with partition, right? That in some senses, the failure of the modern Indian political project just meant it was absolutely impossible to conceive of India as a distinctive kind of ethical space, right? With a different imagining of the grounding of the autonomy of ethics and, in some senses, moral priority. I mean, what partition did to the subcontinent was it basically brought it back to the realm of very quotidian power politics. So where are we now in thinking about these alternative models? If the representative frame ended up with something like India's constitution, a modus vivendi we are clutching onto, community collapsed on its own terms, and this ethical frame, in some senses, could not again carry the burden, right, of politics. Where are we left? Now, what I would submit in closing, just kind of one paragraph, is that if you want to think of contemporary Indian politics, you might say that contemporary Indian politics is shaped on the embers, the burnt embers of all of these failed projects, right? And what has taken the place of these projects, right, is a thoroughgoing embrace of one particular aspect of modernity, in some senses, which is, if you think of that ethical frame, Hindu nationalism, people talk about it in terms of what it has done to Hindu identity, Hindu-Muslim relations, prejudice. But if you think of it, in a sense, its ethical core, its ethical core is that very self-conscious attempt to negate this idea of India as an ethical space, right? So, first of all, it rejects the explanatory priority of the ethical. It is power and competition all the way down. I think Binoy Kumar Sarkar, probably the most kind of articulate exponent of that view, almost a kind of Schmittian view, that actually in the modern world, right, the one thing that is not going to work is, in a sense, the autonomy and the self-grounding of the ethical, either as a moral principle or, in a sense, as an explanatory variable in politics. So this is, in some senses, power in all its material realities all the way down. It's in a sense, a kind of negation, in some sense, of that imagining of that alternative modernity. Second, paradoxically, it's the first philosophy that actually wants to take on both popular sovereignty and statism and combine them. With due apologies to Richard, one of Binoy Kumar Sarkar's most controversial claims was that actually German fascism was the perfect combination of Hobbes and Rousseau. It was a perfect combination of Hobbes and Rousseau because it combined the absolute power of the sovereign state with the unitary will of the people, right? And if you are interested in power politics, if it is power all the way down, then this is the only distinctive form of modern political power that has actually, in some senses, any chance of succeeding. Right? I mean, it empowers the people in some senses through this vicarious identification in a unitary will, right? And so what you are left with, in some senses, in Hindu nationalism, right, is, in a sense, as I said, it's built on the ruins of these three failed projects, right? It's said, look, the project of representation failed, and it's a live project live issue in both India and Pakistan, right? It doesn't care about community. It's the first colonization of Hindu religion by the state, right? And it is a thorough and decisive rejection of the idea that an alternative Indian modernity will have to occupy some kind of ethical ground. And so what we are left with is, in some senses, is this political theory, and it is a political theory, right? With, in some senses, kind of deep views about the nature of political agency, right? now contending and doing away with the last gasp of that end of history moment, which was the enunciation of the basic structure of the Indian Constitution, right? And what comes after the end of history, if you take my story, if my story is half plausible, unfortunately, is not an unborn world of the kind Radhakrishnan imagined, but possibly a deeper politics of nihilism. Thank you.